Distinguished fellow panelists and members in the audience, I must begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me to come and speak on this very important topic, the changing face of capitalism and the global finance capital. It's a very vast topic, but nonetheless I'll try and present a very brief thing. I think the first thing to appreciate is the scale at which things are changing. If you see in the last 1.5 years, there have been two big shocks in the economy. First the demonetisation and then the GST. And both are damaging the unorganized sector very badly. The unorganized sector where 93% of the employment is there and 45% of the output is there. And if 45% of the output has been negatively affected, then what it implies is that today the rate of growth is less than 1%. The government keeps claiming that the rate of growth is 7% or 6.5%, but actually it's less than 1% because if 45% of the output is affected by roughly 10%, then that gives you minus 4.5. And if the organized sector, which is 55%, continues to grow at 7%, that only gives you plus 3.5. So the rate of growth is actually negative, but I'm saying it's less than 1%. So this is a myth that's being created in the economy, that the economy is growing at 7% and therefore the economy is doing very well. The question is, for whom is it growing and at whose expense? So there are two circles of growth today, the unorganized sector and the organized sector. The unorganized sector is being hit very badly, and this move toward digitization is going to hit it even further. But the government claims that that's formalizing the economy. But what good is formalization if the jobs remain in the unorganized sector? So in other words, there's a myth that is being created that the economy is doing well, and I think that's the first thing that we should look at. And what is the sense in which we can see that the rate of growth is not 7% or 1%? The point is, large segments of the population are protesting, whether it be farmers, whether it be traders, whether it be youth which is protesting for unemployment and so on, whether it be the Dalits, whether it be the minorities. So there's a huge upsurge of protests that's taking place all over the country. Now the economy is growing at 7% as it was growing around 2005 to 2008, then there will be a feel-good factor. Today if you talk to businessmen, and I was just talking to some businessmen on the flight coming here, they were saying we are scared to talk. But actually the economy is not doing so well. So in other words, even the business community feels that the economy is not doing so well, so therefore the 7% rate of growth is not really what's actually there. So the question is, today there's a marginalization of the marginal, whether it be in the question of land, whether it be in the question of natural resources, whether it be on other things, the marginals are getting marginalized further. So if you're marginal to the market, you are getting marginalized. Okay, that's the reality. And why is that happening? Because there is an international finance which believes that there should be growth at any cost, because they are the ones who through capital will control them, and they will control everybody else. So exploitation that's taking place, that's having increasing circles of displacement, increasing circles of exploitation, etc. at a very large level. And how does that happen? That is fundamentally in capitalism. In capitalism, when you invest, there's an uncertainty of the future. So there's a risk. And how do you take care of the risk? You try and do various things to take care of that risk. But the risk is always going to be there, and that risk is what leads to business cycles. And as business cycles take place, then your rate of return will come down. How do you overcome that? By increasing investment. In infrastructure is one good area where you can increase investment. So therefore, now the focus after the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008 is to now target investment. So whether it be China with the One Belt, One Road initiative and through the AIIB, it's actually targeting investments so that it can protect its profits. Okay. Now, how does that work? If you have 1 rupee of capital, then through the gearing ratio you can borrow 2 rupees of capital. And what is the role of financial institutions? It is to take the savings of a large number of people and funnel it to capital, to larger. So that's what Keynes said, that the task of banking is intermediation between the investors and the savers. The savers are the bulk of the people who save. The banks take that money or the other financial institutions and then they invest it. They give it to the investors who invest it and who therefore control capital. So if I have 1 rupee of capital, I can borrow 2 extra and I can become the owner of 3 rupees of capital. If I'm in the infrastructure sector, I can borrow 4 rupees of capital and I can become the owner of 5 rupees of capital. If I'm in the derivatives market or if I'm in other financial institutions, I can borrow 10 rupees. So I can become the owner of 11 rupees. But what did Kaletsky tell us? Kalecki told us that this is the cause of instability. So therefore there are two causes of instability that have come in. First is that inherently the future is uncertain. You don't know the future, therefore there will be an instability. Second is, if the gearing ratio is high, then that will add to the instability. And that's precisely what happened during the global financial crisis of 2007-8. That there was a lot of instability that had been built into the system. It had become a big bubble, and that bubble burst. Okay. Now, why does that bubble get created? There's a lot of speculation. That speculative activity leads to more and more financial assets. So, if you have, say, for instance, $700 trillion of assets of a wide variety of kind, and your economy is $70 trillion, then if a 10% return has to be given on $700 trillion, the entire output, the entire GDP of the world is not going to be enough. So therefore, this financial return that you get on finance capital has to be reinvested within the finance sector. If it's taken out, then it will lead to collapse. And that's what was starting to happen in 2005 to 2007, just before the financial crisis took place. So in other words, there's a built-in instability in the capitalist system, and it also is a built-in factor that finance capital begin to dominate. Because if you have 1 rupee of capital and you borrow 2 or borrow 4 or borrow 10, where does that come from? That comes from finance capital, and therefore finance capital is able to dominate over capital. And we saw in the global crisis of 2007-8 that when General Motors was collapsing, the US government did not give it $25 billion which it was asking. Whereas when AIG was collapsing, within 3 months it was given $350 billion of aid. Whereas the employment in AIG was half of the employment in General Motors. And when finally the General Motors and other car companies were given capital, they were given $25 billion to all the car industry, whereas AIG got $350 billion. So you can see, this is what was called the power of the Wall Street over the Main Street. That Wall Street, the world of finance, dominates over the Main Street, the production centers, whether it be in manufacturing, whether it be in agriculture or in other sectors. So this is where finally after 2007-8 the world realized that there was a gap between the 1% and the 99%. So in India 1% controls on white 70% of the wealth, but if you include black it becomes 85% of the wealth. So the disparities have grown dramatically as a result of this capture of capital that's taken place. So in a sense, we have to look at the basic nature of capitalism. That basic nature of capitalism, how is it controlled globally? Through the international financial institutions, whether it be the World Bank, whether it be the IMF, whether it be the WTO, whether it be the AIIB or the ADB. There are 2,500 institutions of global governance. And the task is to capture the capital in different parts of the world, to guide that capital. And in guiding that capital, what has happened is sovereignty of nation states has gone. Today, nation states in the developing world are not sovereign to be able to set their own policy. You have to be guided by policies that are coming from outside. So in other words, our sovereignty is being truncated. When we see that our parliament is not doing what's right for our people, what does that mean? That they cannot act on it because there's a guidance coming from there. So today, a fiscal deficit has become more important than food for the poor. You have to cut the fiscal deficit. Why? Because credit rating agencies are watching, the IMF is watching, and the US is watching, and they will not look at it in a proper way. And therefore you have to cut the fiscal deficit rather than think about how you can help your poor people. So the policies are being guided from there, not here. And these international financial institutions do not have one single policy. Depending on the crisis facing the capitalist system, they change policies. So in 1968, when McNamara became the president of the World Bank, he said poverty removal is essential because the Vietnam is falling because of poverty. So poverty removal became the program of the World Bank. But when Vietnam fell, after that it became the Brazilian model. And the Brazilian model was a free trade. And then the Latin America collapsed in the mid-80s, then it became the Southeast Asian economies. And the Southeast Asian economies was market-friendly state intervention. It wasn't market. And when in 1997 the Southeast Asian economies collapsed, then it became the markets again. And then Alan Greenspan said that markets are self-correcting. But then in 2008, after the global crisis, he said, I was wrong. And he was treated, Alan Greenspan used to be treated like the god of finance world. So in other words, these financial institutions have a changing line. It's not one fixed line. Depending on the need of capitalism at a point of time, the line changes. And the line will keep on changing depending on what the crisis is. And the 2008 crisis is something that we have not yet emerged out of. Now, I can say many more things, but I'd like to just pinpoint a few things. One is technology. Technology has become the big disruptor. Today, technology is displacing large number of jobs, and as you know, for instance, in self-driven cars or self-driven trucks, they are in the anvil in the next 5 to 10 years, which will displace millions and millions of drivers. You have artificial intelligence, which is going to displace large number of people from call centers and so on. So technology is being used to increase exploitation of workers, and we are being led by that. So in other words, we have to be very careful about technology. Another aspect of technology is it makes us short-termist. As Arrow said in his famous paper, world is changing because of technology, and we can't see where we are headed. And because we can't see where we are headed, we all become short-termists. So society and individual society are becoming short-termists. We are having a shorter and shorter perspective, narrower and narrower perspective in both in space and in time. So that's another aspect of it. Then we must also realize that how did all this happen so rapidly? There's a strategic shift that we must realize when Soviet Union started collapsing after 75 and China did a 180-degree turn. That's when America realized and the West realized that the developing world has no alternative. And that's why, as Mr. S.P. Shukla used to say, in 1982, the American ambassador at GATT, he said, now we want to capture your agricultural markets. Okay? Because now you cannot take the help of Soviet Union. Okay? So in other words, the West started pressing down more, harder on the developing world. And that's why in the Uruguay round of negotiations in 1986, you have all the new issues. Trade in agriculture, trade in services, TRIPS, WTO, dispute settlement mechanism, and all these things started coming in. Because West realized it can do it. And that's why prior to 1991 collapse of Soviet Union, the West used to talk about aid to the developing world. Now it talks about capital movement. You have to attract capital. So it's making one state compete against the other state to give concessions to capital, and therefore increase the exploitation that's taking place. So in other words, what is happening is today states are competing with each other. If South Korea is giving this concession, India has to give this concession. If Andhra Pradesh is giving this concession, then Gujarat has to give this concession. And therefore resources of the states, they are being now taken out and privatized. Why is all this happening? This is happening because there is a philosophical change that has taken place. And I call this philosophical change as marketization. It's what in Hindi you can say bazarikaran. Marketization is taking place at a very rapid rate, at which is changing our thinking. And what does marketization do? Where state used to intervene, now market has to intervene, state has to retreat. So the retreat of state means collectivity retreats and the individual advances. You solve your problem through collectivity earlier, now you solve your problem through the individual. So therefore collective action is proving to be more and more difficult. Trade unions are on the margins, trade unions are retreating because of this. So what are some of the principles that marketization brings in? First is, as Samuelson said, dollar vote. So if you have $1, you have one vote. If you have $1 million, you have 1 million vote. It's not a democratic principle of one person, one vote. So in other words, all your democratic institutions get marginalized. Because not a one person, one vote, it's how many votes can you put. So corporate sector dominates over the poor people. Okay, the Americans dominate over the Indians. Okay, because they have 30 times the per capita income of Indians. Second is more is better. And if more is better, then it leads to consumerism. If I have one shirt, I should buy a second shirt. If I have one car, I buy a second car. And consumerism is the new opium of the masses. Today, if you see, for instance, the teachers' movement, after the 6th pay commission, weakened because the teachers got a higher salary, and therefore they started weakening. They did not participate in the protest movement that took place. And similarly, many other organized sector people, they don't participate in movements in the way that they used to participate earlier. So in a way, this more is better. Third is homo economicus. Only economics matters. Society doesn't matter. Emotions don't matter. Sociology doesn't matter. History doesn't matter. So models of economics today are ahistorical. And that's why Samuelson complained in 1986 in an article. He said for the modern day young economist, economics begins in 1980 with game theory. Before that, there's no economics. Okay. Now this ahistorical character is what suits capital. Because today, you don't have to go back into the past, what happened in the past, etc. You can do today. So status quo gets reinforced when you have ahistorical models of this kind. So in other words, I can keep on saying more things, but I'm sure the time is running out. But what we need to appreciate is that there is a philosophical change that has taken place in the average man, the average person. He is becoming short-termist, and it's the task of movements to change that. The task of movements is to bring about the real character of capital, the capture of capital, of the imagination of the individuals, and then the issue of land, the issue of displacement, all these issues will come alive, because you have to build a wider understanding of where our thinking is changing. For the young people, why young people are not participating in the same way? Because they're told, enjoy life, and there is this thing of rational individual. Who's a rational individual? One who's maximizing his profit, okay? So rationality is maximized. Now, therefore, greed has become now acceptable. So it's not that greed did not exist earlier, but greed has been raised to a new pedestal today, okay? And so everybody is caught up in this part of greed, part of consumerism. So we have to bring about a holistic understanding with which then people will begin to become more. And one last thing, people are becoming atomistic, people are becoming self-centered, and maximizing their gains at an individual level, not the collective. So we have to bring that collectivity back through raising the issues of the people. Thank you very much for your patience.